I want to draw your attention today to a name that has barely appeared in Western media coverage of this war. A name that, in my view, explains more about why these negotiations keep failing, why Iran keeps rejecting American proposals, and why the gap between the two sides remains so stubbornly wide, more than any diplomatic communique or presidential statement has explained in 83 days of conflict. The name is Ahmad Vahidi, Brigadier General Ahmad Vahidi, head of Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. And according to reporting by the Associated Press published just this morning, he has seized a place near the very center of power in Tehran, directly influencing both Iran's war strategy and its negotiating position with the United States. Now, before I explain why this matters so much, I want to tell you who Ahmad Vahidi actually is, because understanding who he is explains everything about why the negotiations are where they are. Vahidi has not been seen publicly since February 8th, 3 weeks before the war began. He simply disappeared from public view. And in the week since, as Iran's previous IRGC commander was killed in American strikes, Vahidi was elevated to lead the most powerful military political organization in the Islamic Republic. He did it quietly, without press conferences, without public statements. In the Iranian tradition of power exercised in the shadows, he is accused of involvement in the 1994 bombing of a Jewish community center in Buenos Aires, Argentina, an attack that killed 85 people and wounded hundreds more. Interpol issued a red notice for his arrest. Argentina has sought his extradition for decades. In 2022, he led the domestic security crackdown on Iranian protesters, a crackdown that the human rights community described as brutal and systematic. This is the man who is now, according to the AP, a major player in formulating Iran's negotiating position with the United States. Let me be very direct about what this tells us. When you put a man like Vahidi at the center of your peace negotiations, you are not signaling flexibility. You are not signaling compromise. You are signaling that the people who are actually making decisions in Tehran right now are the hardest of hardliners, the commanders who believe that any concession to America is surrender, that the war has not yet been fought to the conclusion that Iran's security requires, and that the Islamic Republic's survival depends on maintaining a posture of absolute resistance. And here is what I find most telling of all. According to the AP, Iranian media carried contradictory reports on whether Vahidi even met with Pakistan's interior minister, the man carrying Washington's latest proposal. Contradictory reports from Iranian state media about a meeting that either happened or didn't happen, and nobody in Tehran is confirming or denying clearly. In 30 years of watching Iranian politics, I have learned one thing above all others. When Iranian state media contradicts itself about a meeting, it is because the people involved do not want the world to know exactly what was discussed. And that tells me that whatever passed between Pakistan's mediator and the Iranian leadership this week, it was not a straightforward exchange of diplomatic pleasantries. I want to explain now why Vahidi's emergence matters so much for the specific question of whether a deal gets done in the next few days. Because Trump said yesterday he was willing to wait a few more days. And Pakistan's Army Chief Asim Munir flew to Tehran with what is described as Washington's latest proposal. And the financial markets are pricing in, betting real money on, the probability of a deal. I want to offer a different perspective. When a hardline military commander is the central figure in your negotiating team, the decisions being made are not purely diplomatic. They are strategic, military. They are decisions made by a man who thinks in terms of force, deterrence, and what Iran can and cannot survive. Not in terms of face-saving formulas or diplomatic language that allows both sides to claim victory. Vahidi did not spend his career building Iran's ballistic missile program, supporting Hezbollah, funding the Houthis, and directing proxy operations across the Middle East in order to sign an agreement that surrenders what those decades of strategic investment were designed to protect. And what were they designed to protect? Precisely the things that America is now demanding Iran give up. Its enrichment capacity, its missile program, its regional influence, its claim over the Strait of Hormuz. This is the man America is negotiating with, not IRGC, not the foreign ministry diplomats. Behind them, in the room where the actual decisions are made, it is Vahidi, and a man with his history, his ideology, and his current position does not give Trump what Trump needs for his midterm elections. But let me go deeper on this because I think the mainstream analysis has missed something important about what Vahidi's emergence actually represents in terms of Iran's internal politics. Since the war began on February 28th, we have had a situation in Tehran that is genuinely unprecedented in the history of the Islamic Republic. The supreme leader, Mojtaba Khamenei, the son of the man the United States killed, is in hiding, wounded, according to reports, in the initial strikes. The precise nature and severity of his injuries remain unknown. His communications with the outside world are filtered through a small group of trusted commanders and advisors. And into that vacuum of visible leadership, Vahidi, who commands the most powerful force in Iran, has moved. This is not simply a personnel change at the top of the IRGC. This is a fundamental shift in who actually holds power in the Islamic Republic. The clerical establishment, the ayatollahs, the religious scholars, the moderates within the system who might be inclined toward compromise, have lost influence. The military commanders have gained it, and that shift has direct immediate consequences for the negotiations with America. The clerics understand the long game. They understand that Iran's survival over 4 decades has depended on a combination of ideological resistance and pragmatic adaptation, that the Islamic Republic has survived not by being inflexible but by being flexible when flexibility served the system's survival. They made the JCPOA in 2015. They have made deals before. The IRGC commanders think differently. They think in terms of military correlation of forces. They think in terms of deterrence. They think in terms of what Iran needs to survive, not just diplomatically but physically, to prevent the kind of assault it just survived from happening again. And their conclusion from that military analysis is that Iran needs its nuclear program, needs its missile program, and needs its control of the Strait of Hormuz, because those are the only instruments of deterrence that actually work against a superpower. That is the logic driving Iran's negotiating position, not obstinacy, not irrationality. Military logic. And understanding that logic is essential for understanding why Washington's current proposals are not going to produce the deal that Trump needs. Now, I want to spend a few minutes on something that connects directly to the question of who really controls Iran's decision-making right now, because I think it illuminates the situation in a way that the daily news coverage does not. The new supreme leader, Mojtaba Khamenei, is not his father. The elder Khamenei spent 35 years building relationships, navigating factional disputes, maintaining a careful balance between the clerical establishment and the IRGC, between hardliners and pragmatists. He was a political survivor of the First Order. His son is, by all accounts, an ideologically hardline figure who has spent his life in the protected environment of the supreme leadership's inner circle, without the political experience, the institutional relationships, or the strategic acumen that his father accumulated over decades. He is wounded. He is in hiding. He is relying on a small group of IRGC commanders, of whom Vahidi is apparently the most influential, to manage both the war and the diplomacy on his behalf. What this means, practically, is that there is no experienced political moderating force at the top of the Iranian system right now. The man who, in previous crises, might have found the face-saving formula, the ambiguous language that allowed both sides to claim enough of what they wanted, the diplomatic exit that preserved the regime's domestic legitimacy while making the strategic concessions necessary for peace, that man is gone. What replaced him is a wounded, inexperienced successor surrounded by military hardliners who believe the path to security runs through resistance, not compromise. That is the environment in which Pakistan's Asim Munir is trying to deliver Washington's proposals. And I have enormous respect for what Munir is attempting. Pakistan's mediation throughout this crisis has been genuinely courageous and strategically important. But even the most skilled mediator cannot bridge a gap between parties whose fundamental interests are as incompatible as America's zero enrichment demand and Iran's insistence on its NPT rights, when the Iranian side of that gap is controlled by a general who was indicted for terrorism, who has spent his career building the infrastructure that America is demanding he surrender, and who is now answerable to a wounded, isolated supreme leader who cannot afford, politically or militarily, to appear to capitulate. I want to be honest with you about something that I do not think the optimistic diplomatic language coming out of Washington and Islamabad fully reflects. The emergence of Vahidi as the central figure in Iran's decision-making does not mean that a deal is impossible, but it means that the deal that is possible, if any deal is possible, looks nothing like what Donald Trump has been telling the American public to expect. Let me explain what I mean by that. Trump needs, for his domestic political audience, a deal that he can present as a victory. He needs to be able to stand before the American people and say, we destroyed Iran's nuclear program. We restored freedom of navigation in the Strait of Hormuz. We ended the threat. We won. That is the narrative he needs. Not just for his ego, though that is certainly a factor, but for his political survival. The midterm elections are in November. The American economy is under strain from $4.52 a gallon gasoline. Harvard says this war will ultimately cost $1 trillion. The domestic political patience for continued conflict is visibly eroding. What Vahidi and the hardline clique around Mojtaba Khamenei can agree to, if they can agree to anything, is a very different kind of deal. It would preserve Iran's enrichment infrastructure at reduced levels under enhanced IAEA monitoring. It would acknowledge Iranian management of the Strait of Hormuz through some diplomatic formula that stops short of explicit American recognition, but also stops short of explicit American rejection. It would release Iran's frozen assets. It would include a phased withdrawal of the American naval blockade. And it would leave the question of Iran's missile program, the question that is most directly relevant to Israeli security, in the same ambiguous, deferred, unresolved state that it has been in for years. That is not a deal that Trump can sell as a victory. And it is, in my honest assessment, approximately the best deal that is actually available given who is making decisions in Tehran right now. This gap between what Trump needs politically and what Vahidi can accept strategically is the gap that Pakistan is trying to bridge. And I want to be very clear, it is not a gap that can be bridged by clever language or creative diplomacy alone. It requires one of the parties to accept an outcome that is significantly worse than what they publicly demanded. And in the current domestic political environment in both Washington and Tehran, neither side is in a position to do that openly. Let me now turn to what I consider the most alarming development of today, which has received far less attention than the Vahidi story, but which connects directly to the question of whether the next few days produce a deal or a catastrophe. The House of Representatives is taking another vote today on the Iran war. Democrats are described as hoping for a breakthrough. This follows the tied vote of 212 to 212 on the War Powers Resolution last week. Now, I want to explain why this matters in a way that I think most of the commentary has missed. The significance of these congressional votes is not primarily legal. Yes, there is a constitutional question about whether the administration has proper authorization for continued military operations. That is a real and important question. But the more immediate significance is political and psychological. Every time Congress votes on constraining this war, even when those votes fail, it sends a signal to Tehran. It tells Iran's decision makers the domestic political consensus in Washington for this war is not solid. The American president does not have the full backing of his legislature. The political cost of continuing is rising, and therefore the cost of holding out, of waiting, of maintaining resistance, of refusing to make the concessions that Washington demands is lower than it might otherwise appear. In other words, the congressional votes are, inadvertently, strengthening Iran's negotiating position. Every tied vote in the House, every senator who switches sides, every piece of legislation aimed at ending the war, these reduce the credibility of Trump's threat to resume military operations if negotiations fail, because they demonstrate that the domestic political environment in which that threat would have to be executed is deteriorating. I am not making a partisan argument here. I am describing a strategic dynamic, and it is a dynamic that Vahidi and his colleagues in Tehran are observing, calculating, and factoring into their decisions about what they can and cannot accept. The weapons demonstration in Tehran yesterday adds another dimension to this picture that I want to address because it has been reported primarily as domestic propaganda, an attempt by the Iranian government to reassure its own population that the military remains strong. And that is certainly part of what it is. But it is not only that. When a government conducts public weapons demonstrations in its capital city during active peace negotiations with the country that has been bombing it for 3 months, it is sending multiple simultaneous messages. To its own population, we are strong, we have not been broken, the weapons that protect you still exist. To the international community, whatever deal we sign, whatever concessions we appear to make, we retain the military capacity to defend ourselves. And to Washington, do not mistake our willingness to negotiate for weakness. The weapons are real. The capability is real, and any deal that leaves us defenseless is not a deal we will sign. Vahidi authorized those demonstrations. He chose the timing, and he chose it on the same day that Pakistan's mediator was in Tehran carrying Washington's proposal. That is not a coincidence. It is a message delivered with military precision to a diplomatic audience. I want to spend a moment on the European dimension of today's news because it adds a context that is important for understanding the full scope of what is at stake. The AP reported this morning that the energy shock from the Iran war is expected to weigh on Europe's economic growth and boost inflation. This is not a surprise to anyone who has been following the economic consequences of the Hormuz closure. But the specific timing of this report, coming as negotiations are supposedly in their final stages, as Trump says he's waiting a few more days for the right answers, is a reminder that the costs of this conflict are being borne not just by Americans and Iranians, but by European families, Asian manufacturers, Pakistani consumers, and people around the world who had no voice in the decisions that created this situation. Europe in particular is in an extraordinarily uncomfortable position. Its governments have nominally supported the American position. They backed the UN resolution on Hormuz. They participated in the diplomatic pressure on Iran. But they are simultaneously negotiating shipping arrangements with the Revolutionary Guard Navy, watching their economies slow under the weight of elevated energy costs, and increasingly impatient with a conflict that is imposing severe costs on their citizens with no clear end in sight. The political pressure on European governments to find a way out of this situation is building. And that pressure adds to the already substantial pressure on Washington to accept a deal, any deal, that can be presented as ending the conflict, even if it falls well short of the objectives that were stated when the war began. Let me now try to pull together everything I have described today into an honest assessment of where this goes from here. Ahmad Vahidi is not going to surrender Iran's nuclear enrichment capacity. He is not going to formally acknowledge American authority over the Strait of Hormuz. He is not going to accept a deal that he and his colleagues perceive as the diplomatic equivalent of the military defeat that American bombs failed to achieve. This is not irrationality. This is the logical calculation of a military commander who has spent his career building Iran's deterrent capacity and who understands that surrendering it, under duress, would make Iran permanently vulnerable to the kind of assault it just survived. And Donald Trump is not going to accept a deal that he cannot present as a victory to the American public. Not because he is incapable of compromise, I think he is more pragmatic than his rhetoric suggests, but because the domestic political mathematics of his situation require him to have something to show for $29 billion spent, for elevated gas prices, for the strain on American military readiness, for the diplomatic costs of a war that has damaged America's relationships and reputation across significant portions of the globe. These two realities, Vahidi's red lines and Trump's political needs, are not easily reconcilable. Pakistan's Asim Munir is doing genuinely important work trying to find the formulation that threads this needle, but I am skeptical that such a formulation exists in the time frame that both sides are working with. What I think is most likely, and I want to be clear that this is my assessment based on the evidence, not a prediction I make with certainty, is a partial, face-saving framework that defers the hardest questions, that uses deliberately ambiguous language to allow both sides to claim enough of what they want, and that is presented publicly as a deal while leaving the underlying incompatibilities unresolved. A framework that stops the shooting, partially reopens the strait, releases some frozen Iranian assets, and kicks the nuclear question into a future negotiating process that both sides know may never produce a final resolution. That is not a satisfying outcome. It is not the comprehensive, permanent resolution of the Iranian nuclear question that Operation Epic Fury was supposed to deliver. But it may be the only outcome that both Vahidi and Trump can accept, precisely because its ambiguity allows each side to tell its domestic audience what it needs to hear. The alternative, resume military operations, is possible. It remains on the table. Trump has not taken it off the table and will not take it off the table as long as the negotiations continue, because the threat of resumed operations is the only leverage Washington has. But the costs of resumed operations, military, economic, political, diplomatic, are real, enormous, and growing more constraining with every passing week. I will be watching the House vote today. I will be watching what comes out of Asim Munir's conversations in Tehran. I will be watching whether Ahmad Vahidi, the general nobody was talking about until this morning, is willing to take a phone call, attend a meeting, or sign a document that gives Donald Trump enough of what he needs to stand before the American people and say, "It's over." I don't know if he will. Based on who he is and what he believes, I have my doubts. But I have been surprised before. And the next 72 hours will tell us whether Ahmad Vahidi is the man who ended this war or the man who made its resumption inevitable.